All right, well, I'd like to thank everybody coming out on a nice night like tonight. I'd like to remind everybody, if you are a train buff, we have our thing tonight, but also next month on May 1st, we're going to have Jack and Kay Dickinson talking about the Norfolk and Western in West Virginia, and their story is called Every Bloodstained Mile. Now, tonight we had Bob Withers, and when I called Bob to do this, he was gracious enough to do it, but he also said that he wanted to change the name of his book. He came up with one, Presidents, Politics, and Pullmans, and he told me that the publisher of the book said people won't know what a Pullman is. So I'd like to tell Bob that I think at least this crowd knows what a Pullman train is, and they appreciate it. So tonight we're going to be talking about presidents, politics, and Pullmans. I know right now, me personally, I'd like to see a few politicians ran over by trains. I'm tired of hearing them talk and listening to them. But I won't say that in the sense about presidents, because that gets you in real trouble. But we'll go ahead and start here with Bob. Bob's written and edited several books, dozens of freelance magazine articles, and hundreds of newspaper articles about railroads, steamboats, and historical subjects. His first book, The President Traveled by Rain, was published in 1996. Even worse than politicians, he is a newspaperman. So he retired from the Huntington Herald-Dispatch in 2007 after a 38-year career as a reporter and copy editor. That's back when we were good guys, right? Amen. He has been a pastor for 40 years, 29 of which have been at the 7th Avenue Baptist Church in Huntington. He's married to the former Sue Ann Saunders, and they have 3 daughters and 4 grandchildren. In addition, Bob here was a recipient of the History Hero Award during a ceremony at the Cultural Center last year. So without further ado, Bob Withers.
Thank you for having me, and I want to start off right now with a commercial. This is the book. I have 5 copies left, and if I don't find a grant to reprint, these will be the last 5 copies sold, period, by me. If anybody wants to look through the book after my presentation, or during my presentation as far as that's concerned, I'll make it available to anybody if they'll buy it, you know. Anybody that gets it gets the book plus a supplement that brings it up to date. The book came out in 1996. Every presidential election since then, I have added to this supplement that I stick in the back of any book that I sell. Plus, I have a very distinctive bookmarker that was designed by a printer in Huntington, Goodall Printing, Greg Goodall. He did a very good job putting my name on the side of a Pullman car, and I just love that thing. The only thing wrong with it, I've changed email addresses twice, so the email address is wrong, but everything else on here is right. But if anybody would like to look at it, I'll start this around. You can pass it by or throw it back at me or whatever you want to do while we talk. There are some photographs on the big table here that I picked out a few of them. I didn't want to bore you, so I've got about a dozen or so. But illustrating presidents going back as far as Ben Harrison and including Mr. Obama, or I'm sorry, Mr. Clinton when he left Huntington en route to the convention in Chicago in 1996. Now, what I need to say is that my records, the stories in the book, are not exhaustive by any means. I'm sure presidents traveled on a lot of trains that I didn't know anything about.
A little before your time?
Thank you, sir. That fossil I've known since I was 14 years of age. We were both charter members of the Railroad Society in Huntington, and bless his heart, he's traveled all over the country, various jobs, but a few years he came back and he rejoined, and I've had a lot of precious memories with David Bond. I'd like for you to give him a hand. Anything you want to ask about presidents in the 18th and 19th centuries, ask him. All right, as far as is known, the first president to travel in what is now West Virginia would be James K. Polk, president number 11. He rode on the B&O Railroad from Cumberland, Maryland to Washington, which of course the track goes through the eastern panhandle of what became West Virginia. He rode on the February 13th, 1845. And most of the presidents after that, at least until and through Eisenhower's term, traveled through this state at various times, some more than others, and more frequent the closer we get to modern days. I picked out a few interesting stories about some of them to share with you tonight. Teddy Roosevelt he became president when William McKinley was assassinated, and after he was in office, he ran again as a bull moose, the Progressive Party, in 1912. He lost to Taft and Woodrow Wilson. Anyhow, he made a train trip, a campaign trip on the Bull Moose ticket through West Virginia, coming westbound out of Washington on the C&O Railway, train number 3, the FFE, Fast Flying Virginia. He went to Cincinnati, and a couple days later he came back to Huntington on C&O number 6, the eastbound FFE, spoke at the Cabell County Courthouse, where probably 12,000 people were there to hear him, and then got in a machine, that was 1912 talk for an automobile, and went over to the B&O station where his private car had been transferred to a B&O train, and went up the river to Parkersburg and then eastward toward Clarksburg and Baltimore. There's a couple of pictures on the table of the event at Point Pleasant where he stopped to speak. One picture shows the crowd waiting for him, and the other picture shows him talking to the crowd. Interestingly, as the train stopped at a water stop somewhere west of Parkersburg later that night, the engineer noticed that the rail in front of his locomotive was loose. It turns out that a freight train had gone ahead of the presidential train, and one of the driving wheels had derailed and knocked the heads off of all the spikes on one side of the track for maybe a couple of miles. Now all the rail on that side was loose and fallen over and such. The engineer on Roosevelt's train spotted it. The train was delayed 2 hours while the problem was fixed, and I don't know whether Mr. Roosevelt ever knew what happened. At least he didn't know that night, and he didn't get hurt. Warren Harding made some campaign trips through the state. He was coming down the B&O track from Parkersburg to Huntington, September 29th, 1920. And an equalizer spring broke on the rear set of wheels on his private car called the Ideal at Millwood and in Jackson County. And the car derailed and slid across a trestle, Big Mill Creek, and only the guardrails that kept the car relatively in place, kept it from turning over and going into Mill Creek or maybe even the High River. Harding and his wife were relaxing in the private car when this happened. They had a rather exciting ride across that trestle. They came out to see the damage. The car was uncoupled. They got on another car on the train, made their way toward Huntington, and Harding had presence of mind enough by the time he got to Mason City, just a few miles down the river from Millwood, when he stopped to make a talk. He incorporated that into his pitch, his stump speech. He said, "Don't let the other side derail this nation," or words to that effect. Did the same thing when he got to Huntington. Actually, there was a B&O patrolman named Ernest Chapman, who was one of the security men on that trip, and when he saw what was happening, he pulled the emergency cord to make the train stop, hopefully reduce the damage, and no doubt it did, because the train was going across that trestle a lot slower than it would have otherwise. Anyway, he earned a title among all of the campaign people as a master brakeman for pulling that emergency cord when he did. And he became quite in demand by other candidates and other presidents later. There's a picture of him in the picture there where Herbert Hoover is speaking at Parkersburg in 1932, and Chappie is looking, eyeing at a guy holding the microphone up to get Hoover's words. He was very careful, very cautious. Anytime they took a B&O train out of Washington, Chappie went with them wherever they went all over the country. And he retired in 1957. Had a marvelous story in the B&O magazine about all the presidents that he had run around with and protected. There's a picture there of Franklin Roosevelt's train. The back of the picture says it's the campaign of 1932. But I question that because there's no private car on the end of the train. It's stopped at the 6th Street station in Parkersburg. And the rear car is not a private car, it's a diner. Well, I got to researching it and found out that the picture shows Roosevelt's train all right, but when he was running as vice presidential running mate for James Cox in 1920. Of course, they didn't win. That's the election that Harding won. But the fact that Roosevelt ran as a vice president made him very much familiar with campaign trains and the way to do things. He went on to become governor of New York and then finally the president. Matter of fact, he was our longest lasting president in office, a little over 12 years. Let's see what else here. Truman. Oh my goodness, Harry Truman. By this time, presidents are going everywhere on trains. Long trains. 15, 18, 20 cars filled with reporters and White House personnel, Secret Service, railroad people. Truman was on his way to Fulton, Missouri in March of 1946 with Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was going to make a speech at some school out there, I think.
William Jewell?
Pardon?
William Jewell College?
Okay, right. And Truman took him out on the train. And they got to talking after dinner. The train was somewhere in West Virginia. I think they left D.C. about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so that would have put them somewhere in West Virginia between Grafton, Clarksburg, and Parkersburg after the dinner hour. They got to talking and found out that Truman and his buddies were poker players. And Churchill said, well, I'm a poker player too. How about let's play poker? So they put some kind of a green felt on the dining room table. And Truman and Churchill and 4 of Truman's aides sat down to play poker. And now I don't know anything about poker, but I know it made them laugh when Churchill bet a couple of knaves. What's a knave? Anybody know what a knave is?
Jack.
Thank you. You must be a poker player. Anyhow, at one point, Churchill excused himself to go to the restroom, and I think it was Harry Vaughan, military aide to Truman, said, Mr. President, we're taking this guy to the cleaners. He's not very good. He's down about $350. And the president said, well, we can't do that. You know, we've got to be nice to him. He's our guest. I mean, he can lose a little, but we can't let him lose a whole lot. So when he came back to the table, they let him win a few hands, lose a few hands. When it was all tallied up, he had lost about $200, which was enough, Truman's people said, that he couldn't go back to Britain and brag that he had bested all these American poker players. But he was satisfied. He was still enough. He had the time of his life. There was another thing that Churchill said. wanted to drink. Churchill was, he was good at putting it away, And he asked the Secret Service man to go get him. Matter of fact, he asked the Secret Service man to join him in a drink. He said, "I can't do that, sir, I'm on duty." So he goes and gets this drink for Churchill. He comes back into the lounge, and there's 2 drinks in his hands. And how was it? I think the guy says something about, "Here you are, Mr. Churchill." He said, "I thought you weren't going to drink." "Well, I'm not going to drink." Well, the guy says, "Well, what the heck? How the heck do you think this is your drink?" He wanted both of them. He took both of them out of his hands, drank them down right there. He was a mess. Truman, in 1952, coming eastbound through Parkersburg, Clarksburg, Grafton, was campaigning for Adlai Stevenson against Eisenhower. He came up with a word in Parkersburg, snollygosters, and asked all the press what it meant. It meant something about a gabby fella, somebody that talks and doesn't know what he's talking about. He applied that to the Republicans, but it was funny because all of the press covering his stop in Parkersburg, and by the way, there's a picture of that there, had to run to a dictionary to find out what in the world the man was talking about. The picture shows a Secret Service man on the back platform with Truman, and a man down on the ground who's smiling from ear to ear. Turns out it was a speechwriter, a young speechwriter for Truman, named Ken Heckler, who later became our 4th District Congressman and later our West Virginia Secretary of State. As far as I know, he still plays tennis every afternoon. He's 90-some years old. Eisenhower. You can blame Eisenhower for the fact that I got interested in presidential history and trains all at the same time. His campaign train came through Huntington Wednesday, September 24th, 1952. My mother took me out of school so I could watch it go by on the B&O tracks a block from our home in Guyandotte. Ike was on the back platform. The train was beautiful. Ike waved at me. I waved at him. Instantly, I became a rail fan and interested in presidential history. I was 7 years old at the time. There's several good stories about the Eisenhower train through West Virginia. One of them is that there was no stop scheduled at Point Pleasant. Bartow Jones at the time was a state senator. He wanted the train to stop at Point Pleasant. He was on the train. He lobbied politicians to make an extra stop in Point Pleasant so that people in Mason County, his constituents, could see Ike and hear what he had to say. The jury was out for a while as to whether Ike would make that unnecessary or unscheduled stop. But unbeknownst to anybody on the train, Bartow Jones had some guys with a bulldozer setting out of sight at the east end of the Point Pleasant yard. In case the train wasn't going to stop, they were going to pull the bulldozer up on the track and park it there. Well, they didn't have to do that because the politicians relented and allowed the train to stop. They stopped there for 15 minutes. They had other scheduled stops, unscheduled stops at St. Mary's, Sistersville, New Martinsville, and Benwood, and the train got to Wheeling a half hour late. I won't go into all the details about the Nixon secret. How many remember the Richard Nixon secret fund that was, okay. Some Democrats accused Nixon of having a secret fund, which wasn't secret at all, just the fact that few people knew about it. It was some senators who were helping him with his expenses. And there was a big flap for weeks about whether Ike should drop Nixon from the ticket. And they both were on campaign trains, crisscrossing the nation. It was hard to make contact between one train and the other train. Nixon finally went on the air. He left his train in Missouri, I believe, flew down to Los Angeles, and went to the El Capitan Theater to make this, I think it was a half-hour live broadcast, his checker speech, where he talked about the little cocker spaniel that somebody had given his two daughters. The point being, these are just guys that are covering my expenses. We don't have, Pat doesn't have a mink coat, it's a cloth coat. We got this little puppy dog that somebody gave us, we didn't buy it, and all that stuff. Ike was in Cleveland. That was the day before he came to West Virginia. And he heard the checker speech, and so after it was over, Eisenhower's party called Nixon's people and said, we want Nixon to meet Ike tomorrow night in Wheeling, after which he will tell him whether he's still on the ticket or not. Well, most people don't know this. I was able to find it out in my research that Ike agreed to the deal, not in Wheeling. But when his train came into Ironton, Ohio that morning, they took a call in a phone booth at the NW Passenger Station from some of the operatives in Cleveland, and stuffed into that phone booth with Sherman Adams, who became his chief of staff. Ike agreed to keep Nixon on the ticket. But he saved the formal public announcement until he got to Wheeling. That was prime time, He might have been a military man, but he was learning politics, to be sure. One of the fellows, I'm going to interview him, Lord willing, Thursday, who rode the train from Ironton to Huntington, was a Republican committeeman named Paul Humphreys. There's a picture of him sitting in the reception car with a couple of his friends. Paul was given the opportunity to ride the train from Ironton to Huntington, and he was supposed to get off to let some other local functionary get on. He didn't get off. He just sat there. No conductor came back to the car to get his ticket, so he stayed on the train until Wheeling, having no earthly idea how he was going to get home. He is now 97, and I'm going to interview him about how politics have changed in the last 60 years, this being an election year. And I imagine he's going to have some pretty potent statements to make. Eisenhower, after he went through Huntington in 1952, 17 years later, he came back through Huntington on a C&O in a coffin. His funeral train operated from Washington to Abilene, Kansas. Leaving Washington March 31st, 1969, getting to Abilene on the 2nd, I think, of April, turning right around after the burial service and coming back through Huntington on the way back to Washington. I've got some pictures of the funeral train westbound through Charleston and eastbound through Huntington. Mamie Eisenhower came out on the back platform to thank Huntington for the love and the sympathy it showed. I never shall forget that night because it was choir practice night at my church. I went down to see the train. Of course, being a rail fan, I wanted to go to the head end to listen to those diesels when they pull the throttle out and the sparks fly in the air and they take off like a scalded cat. And, oh, the roar of those 3 E8 diesels, Well, I did that. I saw the train leave. By the time the rear end went past me, everybody was back inside. I didn't know she'd come out. I got to choir practice and got a call from the editor of the morning paper. Now, I worked at that time for the afternoon paper. And I said, I'm going over there tonight. If I notice something, I'll let you know. Well, I didn't notice anything. But he called me at church, got me out of choir practice, and proceeded to rip me a new proceeded to criticize me greatly and very loudly because I hadn't told him that Mamie came out to give everybody thank you for showing your love and your sympathy. Never forget that night as long as I live. There's another day concerning the Eisenhower train that I will never forget, and that is the baggage car, CNO 314. That's what Ike wanted. He wanted his body to be carried in a plain gunmetal coffin, carried in a baggage car like any other soldier. He didn't want it on a platform in the private car where everybody's gawking at it. So they selected this car 314. It was an old baggage car. They had to paint it, they had to caulk it, they had to do all sorts of things to get it looking halfway decent. The point is, after that trip, it belonged to history. It was sent to the B&O Museum in Baltimore for inclusion in the museum. But something came up January '73. Richard Nixon was getting ready to be inaugurated for the second time, his second term. A mounted police unit from Cleveland was lining up, had gotten permission to march in the inaugural parade, and they needed a railroad car to carry horses over to Washington. The chassis system came to the rescue. They brought that sacred baggage car back from Baltimore to the Huntington shop and began putting horse stalls in it and hay all over the floor. And a worker at the shops called out the newspaper and tipped us off, and boy did we go into action. We got our coats, we put cameras under our coats, we went up to the coach yard. I talked to Sam Childers, who was the coach yard foreman at that time. I said, "Hey Sam, can we look inside that car?" "Sure, boys, go right ahead." We climbed up in that baggage car and we took pictures of those horse stalls. There's a picture of them here somewhere. Went back to the office and I wrote the only national exclusive I ever had in my life. They're making a horse car out of Eisenhower's sacred funeral car. Howard Skidmore, the public relations man for CNO, called me up that afternoon and cussed me out with words I have never heard before. He said, "You're going to get a lot of people in trouble, Bobby." He used to call me Bobby. I used to. Anyway, they scared the country for a truck so they wouldn't have to use the baggage car after this broke. They found the truck. They took the unit over to D.C. in a truck, and because of a mix-up in credentials, the unit did not even get to march in the parade. Anyhow, they eventually took the funeral car, the baggage car, back to Baltimore, where it is on display today, and as far as I know, there have been no horses in it ever since. George H.W. Bush began a campaign trip in Columbus, Ohio on September 26, 1992. I was privileged to be able to ride that train from Columbus to Grand Blanc, Michigan over the course of 2 days. The train, but it counts for this talk because it was made up in Huntington. All the equipment came into Huntington, the CNO people put it together, CSX people put it together. And it deadheaded from Huntington to Columbus the day before the actual trip. We couldn't ride up on the train because the Secret Service was going to make the final sweep on the way up. So me and a CSX PR person and a CSX photographer drove up in a car taking pictures of it all along the way, and then got on the train in Columbus the next morning. My outstanding memory about that train, I didn't get to meet the president then, I have since, but not then. It was raining when we stopped at Bowling Green, Ohio. And I got off to cover the talk, and some young entrepreneur had bought a mountain of big pizzas to sell to everybody coming to hear the president's remarks. Well, it was raining. As soon as the president stopped talking, everybody scattered, like a bunch of rats leaving a sinking ship. He had this big pile of pizzas there, and he was hawking them to the people getting back on the train. He says, "A whole pizza, $1. come get them while they last. Well, I bought a whole pizza for $1, got back on my car, started eating it. A couple of Secret Service guys came down the aisle. You know, they were starting to relax a little bit. It was toward the end of the first day. Nothing had happened. They were very familiar with the people on the train. They said, do you mind if we share your pizza? I said, not at all, help yourself. So they took a couple of pieces apiece, went across the aisle, sat down in a chair, ate 2 pieces of pizza, and fell asleep. Now, isn't that odd? Secret Service, supposed to be protecting the President of the United States, and they're over there sitting beside me taking a nap. All these stories, by the way, I think they're all in the book. I forgot to add a little commercial in there. I think all these are in the book. The Clinton train. Oh, I got to tell you, now this is not West Virginia, but the second day out, the Bush train stopped at Holly, Michigan for a whistle-stop talk. And I made my way back to the press risers directly behind the private car. I had a good view of the Bush. Well, the security perimeter had been breached. The people, the spectators had torn down or had gotten knocked down or something, the yellow tape, and the security perimeter was compromised, and people were crowding in around these risers. I mean, I felt like a sardine in a can, you know. And they couldn't see the president. There were so many people. They kept handing their cameras up to me and asking me if I'd take a picture of the Bushes because I had a great vantage point. Of course I did, maybe half a dozen people. The last guy handed up his camera. I took a picture of him and Bush for him, gave him his camera back, and as he walked away, unbeknownst to me, he turned around and saw me bending over, trying to figure out how I'm going to get down off these press risers so I won't miss the train again. And he took a picture of me. I've got a small print of it here. He sent me an enlargement of it later. I couldn't find it for this presentation, so it's in some upstairs closet somewhere. But since I'm bending over like that, my friend Lloyd Lewis, I think he has spoken at one of these seminars before, he calls it the hernia at Holly. Now, the Clinton train put me in much better shape because it happened to come out 2 months after this book was published. And I got to ride on the train all the way from Huntington to Michigan City, Indiana. And the owner of the private car allowed me to get on the presidential car after he got off and ride the deadhead movement into Chicago. And the next night, the car was on the rear end of Amtrak's Cardinal heading back home to Florida. And I got to ride in the private car all the way back from Chicago to Huntington. I slept in Chelsea's bedroom. Now, she wasn't there. She'd already gone. I want to make one thing perfectly clear. I was in that room by myself. Anyhow, there's so many stories I don't know where to start. The book had just come out. The word had spread that the book was in existence. I kept getting calls from all the networks, from the politicians, from the White House Communications Agency. They wanted copies of the book. Matter of fact, they kept upping the number all the week before the train came in. And when the train did come in, a day before the trip, my wife and I sold 48 copies of the book on the White House Communications card. We actually went up to a place in East Huntington where they were turning the train on a Y track. I asked a brakeman to stop the train when the communications car got across from us so we could load these 4 boxes of books. And he did that, and we didn't get shot. And I was almost surprised that nobody stopped us, nobody asked for an identification, nobody pointed a gun at us, as far as I know. And we stayed on that train for I don't know how long, looking at this complicated communications gear and selling books and autographing them like crazy. When the trip departed from Huntington, Billy Ray Cyrus, the country singer, rode the train with his father to Ashland. He was going to sing the national anthem in Ashland. And there were two old vintage private cars on the rear of the train. Billy Ray Cyrus was standing on the rear platform of the next to last car, the penultimate car, if you will. When Bill Clinton came out of his car to go forward in the train to have a press conference or something, he jiggled the gate on the rear of the next car and it wouldn't open. So here's the train bouncing along down the track at 40 miles an hour. He starts climbing over the brass railing. The Secret Service went nuts. One of them grabbed the one arm, another one grabbed the other arm. A couple of them put their arms around his chest and they kind of heaved him across. Billy Ray Cyrus is standing there watching all that. I interviewed him about this later. He said, you know, he looked at me and smiled. He said, he's cool. He knew he was freaking out, them guys. I'm trying to think of the guy's name that was a chef for the rear car. Isn't that something? I'm having a senior moment. I've forgotten his name. But anyway, he was stirring some sauce for dinner in the galley of the private car, and he heard a voice behind him saying, "What's for dinner?" And he was hot and bothered, under pressure. He wanted everything to be just right. He says, "I'm sorry, sir, but you'll have to wait till the president gets served." And he turned around, and it was the president. And he apologized all over himself. He said, "Oh, my, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." Clinton just smiled and shook his hand and went on. Trying to think. By the way, I was told that I would be featured in a Time magazine article about the book the week after the trip concluded, but I got knocked out of that because as Clinton's train arrived in Michigan City, Indiana, it became public knowledge that his advisor, Dick Morris, had been caught consorting with a prostitute. And so Dick Morris and his girlfriend knocked me out of Time magazine. Of course, the next week, I was on the news. So my story didn't make it in Time magazine. President Obama made a trip to his inauguration from 30th Street Station, Philadelphia, a few days before the inauguration in January of '09. I watched it, the whole thing, from start to finish on television. I had a reporter friend of mine at Baltimore Sun, Fred Rasmussen. He was on the ground. He was feeding me facts about when the train stopped here and when it went there, and how they passed each other and changed places to fool people and all that stuff. There was one comment that Obama made that I didn't hear any of the news channels reported, but I heard it on two airs. 30th Street Station, Philadelphia has high platforms, so that all you have to do is step over a gap to get on the rear platform of a private car. You don't have to climb any steps, it's just straight across, but there is a gap of about that width between the platform and the train. And I heard Obama say in a loud, clear enough voice to his small daughters, "Don't fall through there or you'll really mess up my inauguration." I thought, my goodness, how concerned can a father be about his two daughters? That's not a political statement, that's just, but many a truth are said in jest. Okay, that's it as far as I can remember. Anybody have any questions? I doubt if I can answer them, but I might be able to take your phone number and find the answer for you. Take it. Yes, sir.
A little bit off subject, but I wonder, is it known who the first president to fly?
The first president to fly in office was Franklin Roosevelt when he went to Casablanca in, I think, January 1943 to confer with the other Allied powers concerning the prosecution of the war. They made a train trip to Miami. This is related to it too, a secret trip. It started out going north, turned around and went south to fool people. It was secret, nobody knew where they were going. They went down to Miami, and then Roosevelt was taken on a couple of, I think it was Pan American Clippers. Yeah, the names of them are in there. He flew across the Atlantic Ocean to Casablanca, and that's the first time a sitting president flew. Any other questions?
Do you ever figure out how many miles residents have traveled over the years by train?
I wish I had. I've got some figures on Roosevelt's travels. Oddly enough, the same year that he first flew as a president was the year he racked up the most mileage on trains. He loved the train travel. He asked him to slow down to 35 miles an hour because, you know, he had polio. He had this narrow wheelchair. I have seen it on the private car Ferdinand Magellan. It was easier for him to navigate through the hallways, the narrow hallways in that car, if the train kept to a slower speed. I had hoped to at least see the White House logs that kept track of presidential travel. I was privileged to go with my wife to visit the current transportation officer, at the time he was current, Billy Dale, in February of 1993. We went over to the National Prayer Breakfast and made arrangements to see him in his office at in the old executive office building. He said, for one thing, he showed me a log that had started about the time of, if I remember right, Theodore Roosevelt, and I copied as much of it as I could in the limited time I had. He said an older log a while back had been tossed, just tossed. And I wrote a letter back to him soon after I got home. I said, you know, if you guys ever want to toss the one you have, toss it my way. But here's again a stroke of rotten timing. You may remember the Travelgate controversy where Hillary Clinton got after the travel office, fired Billy Dale, fired all the people that I had become acquainted with on the Bush train. I don't know what happened to that letter, but I know I didn't get it. So I can't answer your question. I took a long time to tell you that, didn't I? Anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
I don't assume that Jefferson Davis never traveled by train through any part of the counties that became West Virginia.
No.
Because he never could get that far outside of Richmond.
Well, he got out of Richmond real quick there toward the end of the war.
He did.
And that was by train. Matter of fact, I almost included something about him in the book, but putting this book together, I wrote twice as much material as the publisher had room for. Had to go back and cut half of it out. Robert Kennedy's campaign train and funeral train were cut to the bone, and Jeff Davis didn't make the cut at all. But I've got a file that high, old dot matrix printouts at home, the original text, so a lot of times when I want to find something, it's not in the book, I go back there to the original and it's there. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I was wondering, what sort of information did the various railroads and various railroad historical society have to help you in your research?
A few railroad historical societies did help, the California State Railroad Museum and some others. I got the most help from the presidential libraries. Made a research trip, actually two research trips, to one of them eastbound to Washington and New York, on the publisher's dime, by the way. Went to several libraries, Library of Congress, National Archives, Engineering Library in New York Public Library. Then I made a western trip where I covered Abilene, Kansas, the Eisenhower Library, Hoover's home place in Iowa, the Lincoln home in Springfield, Illinois. Where else do we go?
A Truman in Independence?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I got a wonderful story about that. In 1995, my wife and I rode a reenactment of a troop train on Union Pacific between Omaha and North Platte, Nebraska, and returned. We met a man on that train who was the co-pilot of the second plane to drop the A-bomb on Japan. And he said he had sent his uniform and some other souvenirs to the Truman Library. Hadn't heard a word, whether they received them or put them on display or anything. Well, when we drove home from Omaha, we stopped at the Truman Library again and walked in, and the first thing we saw was a display case in the lobby that had this man's uniform in the case. And I couldn't wait to get home and call him and tell him, yes, they got it, and they put it on display. And he was one happy camper after that. Anybody else? Thank you for having me. Don't forget, I've got 5 heavy books I'd like to sell and not have to take them home tonight. Yes, sir? Oh, goody, a customer. Yay! As soon as I get my table and chair here, I'll sign it for you and we'll be in business.
All right, let's give them a hand.
Oh, that's when I passed around, that's right. No, I got some. I forgot my box over there.
Thanks, everybody, for coming out.
Doing there.
With the tax, it's $52.35, but the autograph and the bookmarker and the supplement are absolutely free.